Next week, Saturday Night Live returns. And on Thursday, producer Lauren Michaels confirmed on the record that comedian Maya Rudolph is going to come back this season. As you may know, she's played Kamala Harris on the show. So I was curious, who are they going to pick to play J.D. Vance and Tim Walz? Do you guys have suggestions?
God, these questions are always so hard at the start of this podcast.
Yeah, the problem is that I have no idea who any contemporary actors and comedians are.
Well, who's going to play RFK Jr.? That's the other question.
Oh, that is the question. Maybe RFK Jr. will play RFK Jr.
I feel like he would be game to show up on Saturday Night Live. I don't know. Feels like
they'll bring back Pete Davidson in like a muscle suit.
That is an inspired choice, Michael. Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, September 20th. I'm Elahe Izadi, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by Michael Shearer, who's a national political reporter covering campaigns, Congress, and the White House here at the Post. Hey, Michael.
It's great to be back with you guys.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here to talk about a few things today. And one of them is an article that, Aaron, you wrote this week on the state of the presidential race after the first and maybe only debate that will take place between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. I know there was a lot of waiting around to see what impact the debate could have, and you found some encouraging signs for Harris in some polls.
Yeah, I think there's certainly some emphasis on some there. We haven't seen an overhaul of the race necessarily. But then again, we haven't seen that at all throughout the race, really. We're also going to be talking about the second potential assassination attempt last weekend targeting Donald Trump, which is causing some reining in of his freewheeling style on the campaign trail and also some friction. And finally, we're going to talk about a couple other developments as well, including the exploding controversy surrounding Republican gubernatorial nominee Mark Robinson in North Carolina and a non-endorsement from the Teamsters union in the presidential race.
Yeah, so much to cover. Let's first start, Michael. I want to talk about Trump's campaign style and how it's getting reshaped by these security concerns. I know that, Michael, you and our other Post colleague, Josh Stassi, friend of the pod, you all wrote about the tension between how Donald Trump likes to engage with his supporters on the campaign trail and how that's running up against very real threats of harm that he's under. So first, can you just describe how did Trump operate in campaign before these high-profile possible attempts on his life?
So when he left the presidency, he kind of returned to the life he had lived before. He had security, he had Secret Service. There were restrictions, but we've talked to people who say they went to Mar-a-Lago. They don't remember being wanted when they came in those first years.
And he lives there, right, in this resort?
Yeah, part-time, partway through the year. He winters in Florida. He tends to spend the summers further north, usually at his Bedminster club. But in both cases, he loves holding court. He loves having friends and guests come. He would often appear at dinner. He would circulate among the crowd. You know, remember, there were people meeting with him that even his aides didn't know about, that weren't really cleared through Secret Service in those first months after he left the White House, because you could just get in. If he wanted to meet with you, if someone said it was okay to come to Mar-a-Lago, you could go. And as this campaign has developed, a number of threats have come forward that have really changed and come to become a real distraction for the Trump operation, a real burden. I mean, security is normal for campaigns. What Trump is going through now is a whole step above that because the threat is so acute, not just from the two suspected assassination attempts, one confirmed, the other suspected, on his life, but also because there's been this Iranian threat in the air, and that's a nation-state threat that ever since Trump ordered the assassination in 2020 of an Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian government has been pursuing, according to U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies, efforts at retaliation. And so the Trump campaign in particular appears to have been a target here. There was a hacking of some of their emails. The U.S. law enforcement has said that the Iranian regime was responsible for that hack. It's caused the campaign to change how they handle their email. There have been suspicions of further attempts even after that hacking at the campaign. So everyone's on guard right now in a way that we just haven't seen in presidential campaigns recently.
So just in describing how he likes to live and interact with people, and then he's campaigning for president, so there's naturally going to be more security. But now all of these additional threats. So how has his campaign adapted to all of these additional threats, whether they're, playing out in the public with literally an assassination attempt, a gunman, and a second suspected one, as you mentioned, to these virtual attacks and attempts? How has his campaign adapted?
There's so many ways, and many of them are very small, but notable. I mean, there have been events that have been delayed because video has shown someone got through the mags and they've had to find the person. They're very concerned, the Secret Service, about anybody evading the magnetometers at those events. We know he has bulletproof glass around him now when he speaks at outdoor rallies. The campaign's been warned about the possibility of a poisoning threat, which has changed how they handle certain things.
Oh, wow.
They've been concerned about drones as a threat as well. We've seen in the Ukraine war that there's just this whole new world of security threats from drones. And Trump was told this week, after the second potential attempt on his life in Florida by the U.S. Secret Service, that some of his own golf courses are not able to be secured by the Secret Service, and he should avoid playing at them over the coming months. There have been more sharpshooters added to his team. He's expressed concern about the effect that has on his guests at his golf club. They come to play golf or have a drink or, have a meal, and there's guys with guns around them. The campaign staff has also had to deal with this. I mean, there have been instances where they have wanted to keep a schedule to have more events, and the Secret Service has slowed that down because they can't staff it, they can't handle it. Normally, the idea is the service does whatever it can to make its presence frictionless. This year just hasn't been that way. Campaign staffers have been offered mental health care after the Butler attack. I mean, some people were very close to that shooting.
Butler, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Butler, Pennsylvania, where Trump was hit in the ear by a bullet. There are multiple investigations of that attack, and that has led to multiple requests of top Trump aides to participate in those investigations, which takes them away from the campaign at a pretty crucial time. So you add it all up, and this is just like a whole added stress that comes. We're now in the final 50 days here at the most stressful time for a campaign to be operating.
Michael, you mentioned all these precautions that they're now taking, having to back off on using email too much, which could be a hindrance, the various precautions that need to be taken here. Do they feel like they are at a disadvantage because of all this in certain ways, or is it just a matter of adapting?
I don't know if they would use the word disadvantage. I think campaigns are about overcoming obstacles and facing new obstacles every day. This is just another obstacle. I think it is fair to say it is an added burden, and I think it has hampered what they could do. But I don't think they would argue right now that this is decisive, and they're certainly not sending out the message that there's anything for supporters to worry about going to these events. They're still very well secured events. There's a question in a few weeks, Mar-a-Lago is going to open for the season. Right now, Trump's been visiting there and living there at times, but it's not open as a club. It's a winter club. And right now, the roads, whenever Trump is in town, all around it, it's a very narrow island, Palm Beach, are shut down. And you can only get through there if you can prove you live there. The mayor has said repeatedly, and local law enforcement, the local fire department, that this is a real concern for the other residents there, and it could affect club's operation once it starts opening again. They've taken over actually a parking lot across the street from the club to add a whole new security screening space, which just wasn't there before.
Because it's still a business. I'm wondering, how does Trump himself, the candidate himself, feel about all of this added security, given he is someone who likes to, interact with people directly and move about and golf and do all of these things?
Well, he's sort of dealt with it, by making jokes. We report in this story that he said earlier this year he was going to be able to beat Biden. This when Biden was still in the race, as long as he could stay alive. We reported that when he was told about the concerns about him golfing on some of his golf courses, he said that maybe he should take up bowling. That was his response. But he has also talked about becoming more religious as a result of the threats on his life. I think he has clearly used these threats to demonstrate one of the real selling points of his campaign, which is his sort of personal strength and his image of bravery and sort of being the alpha, protecting the nation. You know, it has not stopped or changed the way he wants to campaign. He wants to do these rallies. He wants to be out there. He wants to keep showing that he's, you know, a fighter willing to fight back against all of this.
It's just become more complicated. Just going back, I am still curious about digging into this idea of like, how do voters feel about Trump being the target of these threats? And Aaron, I wonder, is there any polling about this?
Yeah, it's hard to read because so soon after the first assassination attempt, we had another huge development in the race, which was Biden getting out and Harris getting in. But what we did see shortly after the first assassination attempt was that views of Trump improved a little bit. Like his favorable rating went up, his unfavorable rating went down. And that's kind of lasted a little bit since then. It's difficult to say if that owes directly to that, but certainly these kinds of things can make a figure more sympathetic in certain people's minds. And that seems to be at least what happened for some people after the first attempt.
Well, one other question I wanted to dig into before we take a break is this other candidate who is backed by Trump and how voters might feel about this person. And this is the Republican candidate running for governor in North Carolina, Mark Robinson. On Thursday, CNN reported that Robinson, before he was a politician, posted problematic things on a pornographic message board, calling himself a Black Nazi, voicing support for bringing back slavery. Robinson then posted a video on X before this story came out denying what was in the reporting. Let's listen to that.
Let me reassure you, the things that you will see in that story, those are not the words of Mark Robinson. You know my words, you know my character, and you know that I have been completely transparent in this race and before. Folks, this race right now, our opponents are desperate to shift the focus here from the substantive issues and focus on what you are concerned with to salacious tabloid trash.
Okay, so everyone Thursday night was watching to see if Robinson would drop out of the race before the midnight deadline to do that. He didn't, and the state party backed him. Aaron, what does that tell you about the GOP? What's your takeaway from this episode?
Well, I have many thoughts on this. On Thursday, we kind of got a preview that this story was coming because of some murmurings beneath the surface in North Carolina, some talk about whether Republicans there might try to push him out of this race ahead of that deadline because of this story that was coming. The things that are said on this online adult pornographic website are pretty shocking. There are many things on there that CNN even chose not to publish because they're very graphic, things of a sexual nature. In context, though, is this hugely surprising about Mark Robinson? I mean, this is a guy who has said controversial things for many years. You know, there was him being strongly anti-transgender and anti-gay in ways that we don't see even most Republicans today being. This guy was into birtherism, into anti-Semitic tropes. So in that context, like, is this a whole level beyond what we already knew about Mark Robinson? I don't know the answer to that question. What is clear, though, is that this is a race that is not terribly competitive right now, despite it being a swing state. Mark Robinson is running against the Democratic State Attorney General, a guy named Josh Stein. And most polls show that Stein is already leading by double digits. So North Carolina is a competitive race in the presidential level, but it creates a situation in which the Republican Party doesn't have a whole lot of use for Mark Robinson right now, but they probably do worry about these things blowing back on them, not just in other races, but could this potentially be a liability for them in North Carolina, which is a hugely important state for Donald Trump's apparent path to victory. But it is, at the very least, I would say, a headache for Republicans in North Carolina and for Donald Trump personally.
So, Michael, about the Donald Trump factor here, as I understand it, Trump backed this candidate, supported him, this all coming out, even if he was probably going to lose before this all came out and this controversy erupted. I'm wondering what Trump's going to do, given he's in such a tight race in that state.
There were a couple of Trump campaign events this week in North Carolina, and Robinson did not show up at those events, which is unusual. You know, Trump's going back to North Carolina. It'll be interesting to see if he comes back. I think the Trump campaign is worried about this. In the Trump campaign's worldview, this race is going to come down to 3 states: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia. If they win those 3 states, they've won the Electoral College. The election's over. Now, historically, we would say North Carolina is the safest Republican state of those 3 states. But there have been some polls recently that haven't shown that show actually North Carolina is leaning more towards Harris than Georgia is, where Trump still has a slight edge. And that's a concern. And remember, Democrats have been running from the beginning of this campaign, not just against Trump as a person, but against the idea of this sort of MAGA extremism, turning the page on this craziness. They have a lot of money. I would not be surprised at all if the Harris campaign has an ad up soon in North Carolina, or some outside group has an ad up soon in North Carolina showing Trump praising Mark Robinson and then showing some of the things Mark Robinson has said. And what you're aiming for in those ads is not the diehard Trump people who are not going to go away. They love Trump. It's the Republicans who are sick and tired of the Trumpist noise in our ecosystem who might say, look, I just can't handle this anymore. Maybe I want to stay home.
Yeah, and the other interesting aspect of this is Mark Robinson is not the first Republican nominee in a swing state or a key statewide race that has had major problems and, way underperformed what you would expect a Republican in that state to be doing. We've seen this repeatedly in recent years. A lot of these candidates have been Trump-backed, and they have done a lot worse than other Republicans in the same state, or just done a lot worse than you'd expect a Republican to do. These candidates have cost, these Trump-backed candidates have cost the Republican Party more broadly, but we haven't really seen Trump's elevation of these kinds of candidates cost him personally. And that's what I think's interesting here is, like, Mark Robinson is a guy who a decade ago probably wouldn't have really had a pulse in the Republican Party. But he's the kind of guy who Trump, because of his endorsements and because of kind of the permission structure that he creates in the Republican Party, where these people who say extreme things, it's kind of a badge of honor, like it greases the skids for people like Mark Robinson to emerge in these primaries. And then that becomes a problem in the general election and potentially a problem for Trump personally now.
So fascinating. Well, let's take a quick break here. And when we come back, we're going to get into the ways the presidential debate has shaken up the polls. We'll be right back. Okay, Aaron, I want to get into your wheelhouse, polls. I feel like, I don't know about you, both of you, but I feel like I keep getting bombarded with all of these polls and these numbers showing a very, very tight race for the presidency. But Aaron, I know that you were looking into specifically whether the debate, can we believe it, it was only a week ago, whether that has changed anything. What did you find?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of polls. I think there was at one point like 5 polls of Pennsylvania alone in a 24-hour period. So
I feel bad for all these people in Pennsylvania who keep getting phone calls and emails and stuff.
Yeah, no, I'd like to get a poll. I'd like to get a call from a pollster one of these days. It still hasn't happened. So a few reflections. I looked at pretty much every poll that's come out since the debate because we were all wondering if this strong performance by Kamala Harris, and she won the debate going away according to all the evidence, how much it would actually impact the race. And the answer appears to be she got maybe a small bump nationally, like 1 or 2 points. Some polls show no bump, some polls show a bigger bump. The average is kind of 1 or 2 points. Where she has gained more is on personal characteristics. So people came out of the debate thinking that she's more charismatic, that she's calm under pressure. They think she presents well as a candidate and she's persuasive. She gained on these things while Trump lost a little bit of ground on these personal characteristics. And so I think it creates a situation in which, we have seen so few things impact the polls instantly in this race. Trump was convicted of 34 felony counts earlier this year, and it barely budged the polls. Even the first Biden-Trump debate that ultimately pushed Biden out of the race, we didn't see a huge instant impact from that. It was kind of over the course of several weeks, and the concerns grew over that period of time. It wasn't instant. And so...
Sorry, Aaron, can I ask why? Like, why do you guys think there hasn't been a clear impact on these big things?
Well, we are just so polarized as a country that there are relatively few votes that are truly up for grabs and people that can kind of shift between the candidates. That's a big reason for it, but I also think there's something to be said for the impacts of these things taking place over longer periods of time. I mentioned the first debate and how that wasn't very instantaneous in what it did to the polls, but it does kind of set the narrative for the race ahead. It points to potential liabilities and strengths for the candidates that get chewed over in the weeks to come. And so we did see after that first debate, the polls kind of continued to shift over time. And I think that if you're the Harris campaign and you're looking at these polls, kind of the best case scenario here is that the debate made people like her better, and it kind of gave them pause about Trump. And maybe over the course of a longer period of time, that matters with a larger number of voters. But of course, we are talking about a very small number of voters that can possibly shift here. And so we really need to watch those very small shifts that aren't very measurable in polls and know that those shifts are the ones that are going to make the difference.
I would just chime in to say, from the very beginning of Kamala Harris's taking over the Democratic presidential campaign, the Trump goal was to exploit this number they had from their focus groups and their polling, which was that large part of America didn't think she was a serious candidate. They didn't think she was competent. They didn't think she was smart. They thought she'd kind of bumbled the job of vice president. She hadn't been much of a candidate before. And that frame, not serious, came up in their research. If you look at the early ads the Trump campaign put out, even recent ads they put out, they show this same video clip of her dancing at a concert. And that's the message of that clip. The point of that clip is this is not a serious politician. This is not a serious person. And I think to what Aaron's saying, the biggest takeaway of anybody who watched that or even watched the clips afterwards is the Kamala Harris that showed up at the debate was serious. She knew her talking points. She knew what she was doing. She was in command much of the night. And she was pushing Trump around more or less, on that debate stage. And so that idea that the Trump campaign has been trying to seed in the public that she couldn't handle the job of commander-in-chief, she couldn't handle negotiations with foreign leaders, I think that is the biggest shift that's happened since that debate.
How much of that has to do with the fact that the public already has very strong opinions about Donald Trump? Because he's just been around for a while. He's president for 4 years. Even though he hasn't been president the past 4 years, he has not disappeared. And maybe just as many people don't really know that much about Harris or have that much of an opinion about her. So there's more possibility for people to form an opinion one way or the other.
It's pretty clear right now that Kamala Harris has a higher ceiling than Donald Trump does right now. Like, there are more people who are dug in against Trump than against her. And that means she potentially has room to grow, maybe not a ton of room to grow. And then to Michael's point about, appearing like you can do the job and maybe that being the biggest gain for her from this debate, I was really struck on Thursday by another poll. It was from the Associated Press and NORC, which is their pollster. It asked people, whether you think these two candidates would make a good president. And people said by 6 points that Kamala Harris would, and by 23 points that Donald Trump would not.
Wow. That's
a pretty striking gap, and I'm a little skeptical that it's actually that big. But I think to the extent that could be a reflection of what took place in the debate, and we'll await more data on it, that would be a pretty strong indicator pointing to what Michael was just talking about.
And if you look at the push and pull in the Trump campaign right now, it's over that. Yep. Like, the campaign wants this to be about who took action, who made your life better, who raised your wages during his presidency, who made the economy boom. And Trump goes out there every day and says stuff that reminds people why they may not think he'd be a great president. I mean, he's delivering the message in some ways. He's good in delivering the message on immigration. He's good in delivering the message on economy. But what gets covered is the other stuff he says. What is entertaining about his rallies is not his message on inflation. It's all the other stuff he says when he's at the rally.
And also some of the things he says about immigration become their whole big controversies, too, like everything about the Haitian migrants in Ohio, which we've covered many times and talked about on the show. You know, before we go, I did want to talk about this issue of endorsements. Like we've talked about celebrity endorsements like Taylor Swift, and recently Billie Eilish endorsed Harris. But there was one non-endorsement this week that really caught my attention, and that was the Teamsters union, which represents 1.3 million people. Many of them live in key battleground states. This union decided not to endorse a candidate this cycle, and that's the first time that they've done that since 1996. According to Teamsters, their internal polling showed that their membership was split, but a majority did want to endorse Trump. So I wonder for both of you, what does that tell you about Trump's appeal among this important voting bloc? Michael, do you have any thoughts on this?
We've known for, a decade now that Republicans have been gaining, and Trump in particular has been gaining among rank and file union workers. He does great with blue collar workers, generally non-college educated voters. And what the dynamic has been is that the union leadership is focused on the policies, and they know that Republican governance is worse for their priorities than Democratic governance. And so they kind of overrule their own workforce. And, the endorsement is one thing. It's really, there's a lot of money that flows between organized labor and the Democratic Party that is really helpful to the Democratic Party. I think this is a very important break in that wall. And I think it's a shift that we will continue to see. There's a very dramatic reorientation happening in American politics where blue-collar labor, non-college educated labor is shifting away from the Democratic Party and to the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party is really being embraced by college-educated suburban areas of the country that used to be, more wealthier areas of the country that used to be Republican voters. And that's just another signal of that shift.
Yeah, a couple points on this. One is that the split between the membership and the leaders that Michael referenced, I think, is really driven home here. Elahi, you mentioned that a majority of members wanted to endorse Trump. The poll that the Teamsters conducted actually showed it was about 2-1. It was 58% to 31% wanted to endorse Trump. And so the fact that they didn't endorse Trump, the leaders didn't do that, is pretty significant. Although I'll add a lot of swing state Teamsters have now endorsed Kamala Harris, which is potentially significant.
Wait, sorry, when you say swing state Teamsters, you mean like the local state Teamsters?
Yeah, like the local Teamsters in some of these swing states have decided to back Harris. It's significant historically because the Teamsters have endorsed every Democratic presidential nominee since 1996. Teamsters hasn't always been aligned with the Democrats, and so it is significant that they don't endorse Harris, even if they didn't endorse Trump either. Michael talked about the dynamics between membership and leaders. Trump has been courting the Teamsters and labor unions for a while. There was, of course, Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters president, who was given a speaking slot at the Republican National Convention, even though he wasn't endorsing Trump at that time, which was unusual. This was a primetime speaking slot. And then in the weeks that followed, Trump went on an event with Elon Musk, praising Musk for supposedly striking union members, which is like totally opposed to the priorities of labor unions. Like Sean O'Brien actually came out and criticized Trump pretty strongly for this.
Yeah, so it's like they're trying to walk this fine line. Michael, is there a final point you want to make before we sign off?
It's a tight race. We don't know what's going to happen. This is exactly why we cover politics. We got 40-something days to go, and nobody, no matter how much money they make, no matter how many polls they can put in the field, no matter how long they've been in politics, knows what's going to happen.
Yeah. And actually, voting has started in a handful of states already today. So in some places, we're already in it.
Yeah, Virginia, South Dakota, and Minnesota are now voting. Those states will probably not decide the race, but the voting has begun.
The voting has begun. That is it for today's episode. Thank you, Michael, so much for making time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
And thank you, Aaron. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter. You can find a link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com.
Michael Scherer is a national political reporter covering campaigns, Congress, and the White House for The Post. And Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter.
That's it for this week on The Campaign Moment. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, we'll keep bringing you these conversations on most Fridays. But if you want even more political news and analysis, follow the Campaign Moment show feed wherever you're listening. That's where we're dropping exclusive episodes every week of the campaign season. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sean Carter. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy.
Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Svirnovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Peter Bresnan, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Martine Powers. I'm Elahe Izadi.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Have a great weekend, Aaron.
Bye, Elahe.
Bye.